designers who have taken on their shoulder the responsibility of finding our own identity, which is very much needed to be expressed in this very articulate, advanced medium, which is drawn letters. And from Lebanon, Wael went to the US, studied in RISD, and did a lot of great projects with also his fellow RISD colleague and friend John Key. And then 5 years ago they formed Morqos, which is a great name that spanned from the Americas to Southwest Asia and North Africa. And it's our pleasure that he arrived finally in Cairo, where he should have been here a long time ago, but it's never too late. And we are gonna keep him hostage he thinks he's gonna go back in 2 days, but he doesn't know that I have his passport, and he's gonna stay. And we already have a full-time position waiting for him, he doesn't know that. So we really need you here in this place and in the region, so please keep coming back and inspire us and share with us your lovely work, you and Jonathan alike. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. Masal khair. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I got invited to give the workshop, but I kind of insisted on them to have tonight happen. I think it's exciting for me as a first timer in Cairo to have the opportunity to meet all of you and share my work. And I hope that you will find tonight's talk interesting and exciting and inspiring for you. So we also have a short discussion after, a quick Q&A after this all ends. So if you have anything you want to ask, keep it in mind. My name is Wael Morcos. I'm a partner at the Brooklyn-based design studio called Morqos Key. The other partner is John Key, who is also available with us tonight. I arrived also first time to Cairo a couple of nights ago. I am from Beirut, Lebanon, and John is from Alabama in the USA. We met in Providence at the Rhode Island School of Design. We were both studying graphic design, and that started a collaboration on design projects that is still happening till today. We both moved to New York City. We got full-time jobs as graphic designers at amazing companies, while still collaborating on several projects together. And then we decided that we wanted to start our own practice, our own studio, and we call it our last names, Morqos Key. I'm the Morqos, he's the Key. And this is our glamour shot from our studio. One of the reasons we wanted to start our studio is we had a lot of questions about what does it mean to be a graphic designer today? What does it mean to design for audiences that look like us, that speak our languages, that have interest in our stories? And what does the graphic design practice look like today, and how can we make it our own? So Morqos Key is our umbrella studio to do whatever we want to do. In fact, John is, as well as a graphic designer, our director, writer, and teacher, he is also an amazing painter. This is some of John's work that takes the form of paintings on big surfaces in a very selective colors palette. He tells about personal narratives and personal families and new families and friends that we make together. I'll invite you to check his work and look more the layers of conversation that happen around his work. But together we are a graphic design studio, and actually a month ago we turned exactly 5. It was on February 22nd, 2022. Our studio turned 5 years exactly. So we made a quick 1-minute video that I'm going to play for you that shows a little bit of the things that we've been busy with the last 5 years. So let's hope this plays. when I grew up in Lebanon speaking Arabic, and then I learned French, and then I learned English, and then it became this mishmash. And when I went to my undergrad at university, NDU Notre Dame University in Lebanon, we could not see in books, in the history, in the canon design books, things in Arabic that told us that our language was cool, that our alphabet could look exciting, that we could do very nice things that gets us excited. I think that kind of created this interest for me, because every time I work with Arabic typography or Arabic language, it does still feel exciting and fresh, and I can relate to it. And it's a story that I call home, and somewhere that I can relate. And that journey of love with Arabic alphabet and letters took a long time. It's still maturing and changing. But one aspect of it is specifically font design, Arabic typography. And that is a different way of working, because it's a very technical kind of practice. It's involved drawing a lot of letters. It involves thinking of letters in systems. So it's not about just how beautiful this font shape is, but it's mostly how they all work together, how they become connected, how these bases form one another. A lot of the work that I did in Arabic typography has been in collaboration with Khajak Apelian, an amazing Lebanese-Armenian multi-script type designer. And you'll see I'll name a lot of people that I've collaborated with on every project, because to me that's what brings really richness to these projects. This is what we're looking at is Lyon Arabic, slanted, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in detail. But this is a little bit if you're looking under the hood of what goes in designing, drawing, and developing Arabic fonts for modern use. But obviously the letter form design goes a long way ago, and Arabic calligraphy is one of the most exciting, complex, sophisticated forms of writing in beautiful ways. One of my earliest experiments in Arabic typography was Kufam, which was inspired by the archaic Kufi that was found in these old Masahif and old Qur'ans. And what I wanted to do is to kind of translate this really interesting elongation that happens within the letters into a modern interface. Could this also serve us in signage? Could this work within books? Can this be a display, or will it be a text font? This is Kufam. It was acquired by Google Fonts, so it's actually available for free. The fun thing about designing fonts is that I'm actually building a tool, and I'm giving it to other people to write with, to design with, to set content with. So what is that font going to say is something that I cannot really control, but it's actually part of the discovery, part of the collaboration of me as a type designer with the designers that might use the fonts. These are some really rough experiments with variable typography to include these elongation as a way that could be controlled, perhaps. Another thing that I work on is what we call matchmaking, typographic matchmaking, and it's also an elastic term in itself and holds some political connotation and weight to it. What does it mean when we look at an existing design for a Latin alphabet and we translate it to Arabic? Are we Arabizing? Are we compromising our language? Are we giving our letter form enough representation in a way? Also, the brief is set by a design done by Western designers to start with. But to me, I look at the opportunities that exist in these places. We do live in a multilingual, globalized world where scripts cooperate together, where application exists in multiple languages. There is a need for fonts that retain their essence to operate in multi-scripts contexts. As long as the designers that are brought on the team have enough understanding of the culture, of how it's spoken, of the nuances that come with the letter shapes, if there is enough representation of people speaking the native script on the decision making, I think adaptation of Latin design into Arabic is perfectly fine and actually is very needed and enriching to our typographic palette. And this is how I approach it, and I will speak a little bit in detail how I go about creating an Arabic companion for an existing typeface. What we were looking at was graphic Arabic that was also designed with Khajak Apelian for commercial type. The Latin was designed by Christian Schwartz from Commercial Type Foundry in New York. This is another experiment. another experiment, Brando Arabic for Gold Monday. By the Latin was designed by Mike Abbing. It's an interesting typeface because it existed as a serif and a sans serif, and we designed the Arabic as neither, because the concept again of serif and sans is not really an Arabic concept. So we designed the Arabic in a way that can work with both. So we looked at opportunities where we can add the hiya, or the curvature on the top of the ha, that could evoke a similar structure to the tail of the A without necessarily chopping parts and gluing them. This gives us a very organic, natural-looking Arabic that is also easy to read and looks really dignifying of the history of our letter form. The journey of creating something in Arabic and looking at it and feeling exciting because we did something new also happens a lot in Arabic typography, specifically in this project, which I mentioned earlier, Lyon Arabic. So Lyon was designed by Kai Bernot and published by Commercial Type, and Khajak Abelian myself designed the Arabic companion to it. Lyon is a text meant for books, so it's meant to work in small sizes, in long paragraphs, in like long books. So the Arabic had to be inspired by these less qualities. But what's interesting about it is that we asked ourselves, can we design a version that can work with the italic? And obviously, italic again is perhaps a Latin concept. It's used to create differentiation within the line, or sometimes you can set a whole paragraph in an italic and it creates a different hierarchy on the page. So we did what we always do, which is go back to our history, our calligraphy, and asked ourselves, what did calligraphers used to do when they wanted to create hierarchy on the page? Why do we have so many different styles of Arabic? And how were they used in writing, but also in printing? And you can find that answer a lot of times in complicated and complex, beautiful calligraphic manuscripts, or even printed pages, where the calligrapher would mix different styles to create hierarchies on the page. You can see a title of a book, for example, in Nasr, a subtitle in Thuluth, maybe Dar al-Masjid at the bottom in Ruqa. And this kind of idea triggered the solution for Lyon Slanted, which is the companion for the Lyon Italic. So what we did is we drew one font inspired by a modern Nasr that became the companion of Lyon. And then we were inspired by the Nas Ta'liq, and we created a hybrid of Nas Ta'liq and Nasr that you can see here on the left, that has a much more fluid construction and has a natural slant to it and has different type of letters. So we did not take the upright one and slant it forcibly. We redrew every single letter, and then we ended up with two different families of fonts that work together to create a variation within one line or within the layout. And I will show a little bit examples of how we deployed those type of applications. So here you see the full text family, but I'm also excited to say that we are now finalizing a display version of Lyon that has a much higher contrast, so the thins are very thin and has a lot of stylistic set with تطويل ومد بالأحرف, which should be really nice in titles, and should be released in a week or two, so stay tuned and I hope you like it. Another example of an adaptation is the IBM Plex font that I designed with Khajak Apelion again for IBM. There is a big need again for big corporations to expand to different markets, but yet they want to retain the essence of their brand, what they are, what they stand for, through a body of fonts. Also, fonts are software, so they need to license them. So if you're a big company that you have to license dozens of languages on hundreds and thousands of machines, the cost becomes so high that it makes more sense for this company to invest in type designers to design proprietary fonts for them that cover multi-script. And that was the case for IBM under the creative director Mike Abbott, you see on the top left, that collected a team of designers, each specialized in their own native language. And me on the middle top, and Khajak on the bottom right. We were designing the Arabic version of IBM Plex Arabic. So we looked at the design of the typeface, which was inspired itself by the logo that was originally designed by Paul Rand. So Mike Abbing was inspired by the slab serif, the geometric endings on the letters, this idea of a circle on the outside and an angle on the inside that happens in the B, and some pointiness that you see here in the M, to kind of retain these kind of DNA visual ones to create a typeface that reflects the essence of IBM, and that is something that is natural but also engineered at the same time. Something that combines the human but also the machine. So if you look at these italic forms, they're still fluid, even though they have really clear constructed parts. Again, if you look at the inside of the A, you see that on the inside there's like almost a straight part, whereas the outside is completely curved. So how do you go about designing an Arabic version for such a typeface? What not to do is to cut the letters and paste them together again. What we do, and the process that Khazak and I developed, is to break down the brief or the thinking that led to these Latin letters. And then we try to build it back from the Arabic perspective. So for this one, we had a typeface with a regular width, comes in 3 weights, has a fluid construction that's mostly going to be based on mask for most legibility, has a low contrast, and that's the difference between thick and thins, and is mostly meant for text and UI. And that involved a lot of different little decisions. What you see on the right here is a classical calligraphic mask. What you see on the left is details from IBM Plex. First of all, the contrast, the thick-thin relationship in the Latin the thick is in the verticals, whereas in the Arabic, that thickness is in that horizontal baseline ribbon, if you will, that connects all these letters. Another concept is the idea of an X height. There's no X in Arabic, so that's also a foreign concept. But there is a place that is close to the baseline where a lot of the Arabic letters loop and condense. So that's also an area classically is usually small and can be a little bit exaggerated to include more information there. Obviously, the diacritic dots are a decision that we think about. Are they circular? Are they diamonds? Are they rounded edges or not? We think about the counters inside the letters. One thing to keep in mind is that Arabic has triangular loops, so we might think they're just circled, but they tend to always be a little pointy, and that gives it a little bit more of a sense of identity, but there's also an ingredient that one can play with to make them look more inflated or more squarish, if you will, in construction. We think a lot about the rhythm. With the vertical stems in the Latin create that rhythm, and how we translate it in Arabic, specifically that we have all the negiras, aw al-asnan, but they also come together sometimes in combinations, like the scene, and sometimes we have multiple negiras. You have one that's more vertical to kind of help the eye clearly see it, especially when you have words that have multiple, مثلا تتتابع, you have 3 te, what about? We look at places where we can bring some detailing, and these are the مثلا الحلية تبع الهمزة. أما الإنكنس التحبير اللي بيزيدوا calligrapher by hand at the end of the letters. These are opportunities to also draw them in very decisive, specific ways that could help you give your typeface shape. For IBM, obviously, all the connections of the straight on the inside, curve on the outside is now turned upside down, and now it's on the baseline. So we have to think a way to connect all of these. And what happens when these 3 letters come after each other? So we have to draw these letters separately in a way that creates a flat on the upper side and a smooth curve on the outside. So every time 2 letters combine, you still have like a continuous curve. And then you have to also work it out in a way that you can change letters but still have a continuous curve. Ink traps, how that part thins and connects, is also something that we borrow and then we implement it in the Arabic. So type design, I also sometimes describe it as a hermetic practice because it allows one to take your time and develop all these relationships, all these letters. So you borrow a lot from the decisions that were made by the Latin designer, but it's about how you implement them in Arabic and what makes sense. You might think that all the answers are there, they are not. They still have a lot of things that don't really apply the way they considered in Latin. So we still find ourselves trying to imagine and find answers for things that have not been figured out yet. And I think that is the exciting part of it, that we feel that we're helping define what modern Arabic typography might look like in the future. And that might also include bringing back some more complicated glyphs or religious glyphs that also interpolate between the 9 weights of the alphabet. So eventually the 8 weights of IBM text were released for free also as an open source, so you can all find it on GitHub and download it. And I think that was the exciting part of that project, is when a corporation decides to pay designers for their time, but also understand that maybe there is gain and richness in allowing people to have access to these typefaces. And it's one of the things that gets me excited about these matchmaking projects, if you will. The exciting thing about being good, I hope, at drawing letters and drawing your own fonts is that we can test them in the more editorial projects that we do at the studio. And that means when we're designing books, sometimes we get to test these fonts firsthand and test these theories that we have in our head to see if they work. And I take off the type designer hat, I put on the graphic designer hat, and I try to work with these typefaces and see if my ideas are actually effective and if people are going to enjoy working with it. Because publication design in itself is its own beast and its own set of questions and conundrums that we have to solve. And mostly the question is, how do you resolve the different reading direction? Obviously, Arabic goes from right to left, Latin goes from left to right. And when you put that on a website, it might be easy to click a button and flip everything, but a book is still physical, and the way you experience that book can go in different ways. So do you flip the book on the other side? So sometimes we find ourselves doing these similar exercises. This is for the Sharjah Architectural Triennial Book 3 that is being printed now as we speak. But you see here we have like essays, and then we have a section for images, and we have a section for translation. And the essays are in 2 languages, and therefore the translation needs to be in the opposite language, and it's a book within a book, but it flows in one direction. What do you do with the page numbers? So, it's a fun puzzle. So, one of the solutions we adopted for another book that is being finished now for the Abu Dhabi Media and Art Foundation is designing the book that flows from both directions. So one side is the English cover, the other side is the Arabic cover. And this is also one of the exercises that we share with the client as we are presenting, as we understand the content and discuss it, and create, for example, the introduction of the English from one side, of the Arabic from the other, and the bulk of the book or the chapters is on the inside. And they go in both directions. So each chapter now goes opposite directions. So that also creates some way of marrying the content and not having this whole always centered layout where you have the 2 columns facing each other, which can be harder to read. So for these two books, for the inaugural Sharjah Architectural Triennial titled Rights of Future Generations, we designed 2 books, which is often an easy solution. If there is, it's usually a decision that a publisher will take with the help of their editors. It's not a designer's. We can weigh in on these options, but it's about where they're publishing it, who are the audiences, how many they're printing it, where they're going to be selling it. That can help them decide if they are willing to produce 2 books or not. But that was the testing ground for Leo Arabic that I just showed you, and we designed a book in Arabic and another book in English, and the layout is almost the same, and the structure is also the same. They're almost mirrored, but the books are different. But obviously, again, we live in a world that's no such thing as pure storytelling or pure languages, so we find ourselves designing things like that, where we have side notes, where you have to quote an English title, or have a hyperlink that is also not translated to Arabic, so languages are always coming together, mixing. And this is an example where we use the slanted Lyon Arabic to create highlighted paragraphs, like you can see on the right side of this image. Another project that we used to test Lyon with, and it was a happy surprise, was an exhibition we designed for Rayyan Thabit in New York City at the storefront for architecture. And this exhibition imagined a speculative meeting between an American architect and a French historian over a century later from when these people existed. And it questioned the meaning of the word arabesque, which is also a word that does not exist in Arabic, but it's a word that came from Italian, arabesco, that was coined by these historians and they needed a term to describe the type of architectural detailing they were seeing in all the Islamic architecture around the Middle East. And that's how that term was invented. So the artist Rayyan took this book and then cut out all these motifs and then flipped them back inside out and then presented that book again. I'm going to go on the previous slide. The whole book was laid out flat as pages with all the visual images, only the one that remained, perhaps as a way to kind of question and to turn on its head the idea of what arabesque means and where did it come from. So we worked with the gallery to create the visual identity, if you will, for the exhibition that started with a little signature or a logo in that case. So we nested the English inside the Arabic and we used the kashida as a baseline for the Arabic. But the most fun part is probably the fact that the facade of the gallery takes over a large space of a Manhattan block in New York City, and they usually print vinyls for the exhibition. So that was an opportunity for us to kind of stretch that kashida, that tatwil, as much as we can from one side of the block and take as much space as we can to write the word arabesque. And this is the door that enters to the gallery, and this is the whole facade, and probably the longest tatwil I've ever designed in real life. But that idea of elongation and meeting of languages was carried as a concept for the walls inside the exhibit. So it's not an identity that's playful or colorful or relies on shapes or excessive graphics, because especially when designing for fine art, you want to create a system that supports the message and let the artist's work shine in itself. So it's purely typographic. It just uses this idea of connected scripts meeting in the middle, again using tatwil to create this kind of forms that are more or less solid and finished, and using the Lyon slanted to create these side readings of some of the pieces and captions and biography of the artist itself. And the exhibition was accompanied by a newsprint that also took all the same cues of the design that put Lyon Arabic to test really as a printed text face. And as we did these, we went back to the drawing board and tweaked some little things that we hadn't noticed in time to release Lyon a couple of years ago. Some other type of typography I do is not meant to work as complex system and used by everybody else. It's just a one-piece lettering that is meant to be expressive, to work in the context that it's meant for. And that where Arabic lettering takes place is different from typography. It's not a long system, it's not a software, it's just expressive letters that we design. In this case, for the Saudi Arabian national football team, and the client was Nike, where they were doing these little campaigns for every country that was participating in the FIFA World Cup. And they came to us as to help their art director create the typographic expression of that campaign and ways that they can mix it with the photography and the way they can create the posters and the application for that identity. So it's really exciting to see how, again, we use some of our fonts like graphic Arabic here with custom lettering on the right side that were remixed by their designers. So, which brings us back to one more different way that we work is sometimes we ask to create very specific adaptation of existing logos, and that's also another type of work. So this is not per se branding projects, that more adaptation of existing brands as they are expanding to new markets. So these are very project limited in scope, but they're really wide in their reach and exciting in their applications. This is a stencil high contrast Arabic for commercial type. We also helped Bloomberg create signatures for their different logos as they started expanding in the Middle East. An elegant high-end perfume in London. Burberry, and I think here we took the decision to create something a little bit more organic than a straight baseline, in line with the new look of the brand itself. And more recently, we just did Arabic adaptation for Jo Malone, another high-end perfume and home goods brand in London. So as a studio that operates in New York, we sit at a really interesting intersection, I think, is that we get exposed to international design scene, but I myself, I am from this part of the world, and I keep coming back and involved in projects, specifically the Gulf countries, and we're talking Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, and all the exciting things that they are doing. But it's interesting to notice that that these countries are pretty young in their recent amazing development, and they started realizing that they're relying on hydrogen economies, oil-based economies, is not sustainable for long. And they are now interested and excited about creating and nurturing local talent and creating creative economies. So there's a lot of interest from governments in starting new cultural institutions, in providing spaces for designers and artists and architects to express themselves. And that means in that new positioning that there is need for designers to help them shape these identities, these logos, this new positioning, to communicate this new strategy and vision for the future for the country. So this is why it's exciting to be working on some of these projects that we can find alignment with our values and opportunities to create something exciting. In this case, we recently collaborated with, we worked for the for Dadu, Children's Museum in Qatar, and we collaborated with 2x4, a design agency based in New York City that brought us in as experts in the Arabic language. So Dadu is an exciting new project starting in Qatar. The brand is already out there, but the actual building is still being finished. It's a brand that we work on helping 2x4 finalize the strategy, helping the client decide on the name, which is Dadu, which means it's also a synonym for play, Allahu at Dadu. And it also means the marks that are left in the ground as somebody is walking or as children are swinging on swings, alamat al-dadu or alamat al-lahu, if you will. But for the identity, we went back, because it's a short word, just 2 letters with a vocalization mark, we went back again to the start of the shape of our language, which is the history of calligraphy, and the different ways that the letter Dal is being interpreted. And we also connected back to the strategy that was meant to present this museum as an educational institution for children and present play as the building blocks for growing and for learning. So connecting all these ideas together, we create an identity that gives the client a visual language that is based on these abstraction of shapes that can rearrange themselves, they can become blocks for play, and that can resolve themselves in a logo, where the Latin is nested inside the Arabic, the shape of the logo itself prioritizes Arabic first, the vocalization mark, the fatha, is inside the dal that says a, and the dhamma is inside the dal that says do, and it also unifies the reading direction, so the Latin reads from top to bottom, and so does the Arabic. So it was a long process, but the idea is to create a simple mark for a museum that's future-proof. And like any brand identity, is usually built in layers, like an onion, the ingredients that help the mark and the brand survive the application and retain its essence. For this brand, we chose the typeface Favorit Arabic by Dynamo, the type foundry, and designed also by Khajak and myself. We customized that font to give it round dots to create something a little bit softer, and that will work nicely with the Latin, which is a typeface called Tenon by Signal Type Foundry. So that is, to me, one of the most important layers after the strategy, the core, then the logo, and then the typography. And next comes the visual language that is based on these shapes that can be rearranged and recomposed to create a language, if you will, on its own. So it's like even a different layer. So we combined these English and Arabic fonts into one file that we call Dadu, and we included in it these shapes. So our role in this project is really designing a system that we can hand over, a package that we will give to the museum's in-house design team, So it's very important that we create something that is that can be used easily, that can be deployed easily, that's simple, that's clear to understand, and that does not rely on a lot of personal whims and moods of the moment. But it has to be flexible to reflect the different messages that the museum needs to communicate. Another layer is obviously colors, and here again we went with an approach that emphasizes the serendipitous juxtaposition of unexpected colors, some that are dark, some that are light. And when you start combining all these ingredients together, the name, the logo, the typography, the graphic shapes, and how they all come together as a simple system of a font, the identity comes to life and can be recycled, reimagined, applied on different applications in the future and start anytime needed. But what's exciting is that, well, it's not exciting, but what's tricky is that we as designers in that role, we are imagining a future that does not exist yet with content that is not finalized. So we are imagining contents, we are imagining titles, we are imagining an art direction style for photography. And all this is a part of the creative process of putting together all these ingredients to create the perfect dish. So that's a typical exercise for a branding project. Another thing that we do is exhibition design, and that is also exciting because to me it's also a variation of an identity, but it has to exist in space and to be experienced in space. So a couple of years ago, we worked with the Northwestern University in Qatar for their gallery called Media Majlis, and we helped them design the identity Media Revolutions on the Middle East. It's a really exciting topic, and what they were asking is, how was media used as a political tool to promote, change, express, or challenge ideas and practices in the Middle East? It was created by Hadid al-Tayyib, and it kind of looked and surveyed this history of media and its introduction to the Middle East. So we're talking newspaper, we're talking magazine, we're talking video, TV, cinema, radio, and then later on digital media, social media, YouTube. How did this play a role in shaping social change or help people express themselves? So our role is the designers on the team. So we work with the curator, we understand the vision of the exhibition, and we help them create a way to communicate in the most effective way. In this case, we also are working with an institution. That's the gallery, that's the museum. So the museum has its own graphic identity that's designed already, and that you have to kind of understand, or at least acknowledge in some sort of way. And this is a kind of a graphic that we show the client to tell them and explain to them what we are trying to do, to tell them we are going to acknowledge the museum graphic design identity, and maybe we're going to take the fonts or the colors that you already have, and then we're going to bring some other new things which are supporting graphic elements that are going to be abstract and simple, and that are going to reflect the content of this museum. And then we're going to create sort of a logo or a mark or a graphic that will help you identify this exhibition. So every time you talk about it on social media, on the title wall, it always looks the same and creates a point of interest and immediate acknowledgement of what this project is. Great, so that, if you will, is a summary of a strategy phase that we do for any branding project, and that is alignment with the client on what we are going to do, what we think is the right approach, and so we can get a sign off and a buy-in. So you don't want to go too deep in the process and then the client will be like, oh no, I want the museum of the logo to be the logo of the museum to be the biggest thing in the exhibition. So when it came to creating the graphics, we were excited about these type of, sometimes they call them violators, or because they can allow designers to break the layout. Basically, we're talking about all these rectangles that are sometimes framing some typography, and it happens when you have a lot of information on a page in a magazine. It's different ways to kind of compartmentalize and protect one sort of information from the other, or create hierarchy. So they all take this sort of like idea of the shape of these rectangles. We're also looking a lot about how the news, specifically the tickers on news on TV, also exist in these kind of like stripes and rectangles and house information, and give you the sense of immediacy and type of a news quality to it. And when it came to typography, we went back to newspapers specifically and the type of typography used for headlines. In Latin, Western newspaper, like you see in the middle, they rely on condensed, all caps, typography to squeeze as many letters as you can in one space and to be as loud, as shouty as possible to indicate immediacy and impact of the type of the headline. In Arabic, we have nasakh mastari, which is a type of nasakh that also was developed specifically for advertisement and for titles in newspapers. And it's a nasakh that calligraphers developed for the need to create a big, bold, chunky impact on the page. And what they do is they take the nasakh and they just keep adding baselines to it, and they create a more structured, sturdy nasakh using technically, literally, a masdara, which is why it's called nasakh mastari. So these kind of like clues gave us an idea for some typographic choices, and I went back to a long-time collaborator of mine, Hazak Apelion, who was working on this beautiful typeface called Jarida, that was inspired by specifically a nasakh mastari. So we used that for the Latin typography, for the main title, this nasakh mastari by Hazak, and then we used the museum font as a sub-headline for the exhibition title, and that's a way to bring back the identity and connect it back to the museum itself. And the same thing for Latin, that was the title of the exhibition, from visionaries to vloggers, meet the revolutions in the Middle East for the full title. And you could combine them together like that to create a simple typographic logo that looks like a headline in a news print. Or you can also bring back the colors of the museum and use those stripes as a way to isolate and create this sort of build-up of rectangles that can exist in several lines or only in 3 lines. So, when we have typography, colors, graphic elements coming together, the rest becomes direct deployment and application of these ideas as a visual system. So, even when you are designing an exhibition, it's also about creating a sense of recognition in the space. What you see first is usually the title wall that became this big graphics, and then you have to walk down a hallway to get to the entry to the exhibition. So we work with the curator to kind of formulate questions that highlight the problematic of this exhibition, what it's trying to solve. ما تأثير العصر الرقمي على قوة السرد القصصي, for example. And these are all meant to be teasers that guide you down and invite you to enter the exhibition. When you enter, you have a title wall you see on the left, and you have this huge armature of screens that you see on the right. And in boxes, you have also some artifacts of newspapers and prints and ideas collected that cover several parts of the exhibition. For example, they also cover how thousands of years ago ideas were exchanged at marketplaces, in cafes, in universities, and in trading hubs like Cairo or Morocco and Baghdad. So all these artifacts are opportunities to show different ways people were thinking divergently, and how theater, print, or radio was also a medium to communicate these changes and these ideas that were very important for people back then. I am a designer that loves to work with restrictions, and I think the more restrictions I have, the better I can find solutions that are exciting. The armature was one of those. This is a big thing that was hanging, and they had a few screens on it. What we wanted to do is use it effectively because the whole metal thing could not be taken down. So what we said is, let's embrace all the screens that we can put, as many screens that we can put up, and embrace that in the most effective way possible. So you cannot reach the screen, they're pretty big and pretty high, but they really color the whole space. So what we wanted to create is a way to bring back the rich and depthness of content that the curator was writing and collecting, and use the armature as a way to set the scene. So we created 5 acts, if you will, that populate the armature. And it's these sort of graphics that come and go and allow to create a background for the type of information that you have in the space. So some of them were based on highlighting the category of information that exists in this exhibition. Another act was highlighting the countries that were surfaced in this exhibition, how they were represented in this exhibition. One act that we proposed was taking headlines from news clipping, from magazine, from poetry, from plays titles that we kind of recombine in these little squares that again complement this identity of nested rectangles. Some were a little bit more abstract and were clippings of videos and posters that moved along. And some were introduction paragraphs or small quotes from articles. And as they circled, they kind of gave you an idea of how many things you can explore and discover in this exhibition. Because the majority of the exhibition was actually these vertical touchscreens that one could go against and take a deep dive into some content. And then there was also this big screen that was also an opportunity to also help the curator, is the video working? Yes. To help the curator jumble back some information and communicate it back to the audience. And here again, we were working with the limitation of the physical space that we had, meaning that this whole screen was made of 12 TV screens put together, and you could actually see a little bit of that physicality in space. So we used those division of the screen itself as part of our composition to create visual windows into that content that feels that it's naturally part of that physicality of the screen itself, as a way to engage and to create opportunities for discovery. We also worked with the limitation of these vertical screens. So the gallery had already a software in place that was extremely hard to change, and obviously there was no budget or time or readiness from their team to redesign the whole software. But we eventually pushed them to allow us to reskin that existing navigation. So we brought the graphics for the identity, the colors, and the symbols that we had drawn to kind of dress it back up and create these moments where you can feel that the whole thing is cohesive. The pink color that we chose appears everywhere. The experience connects everything together and allows the user to seamlessly understand that they're part of the same chapter or not, and to navigate what's happening inside. So part of what we did is create a lot of these thumbnails that kind of remix the titles and the typography together based on themes and chapters. And it became like a typographic exercise where we brought these, again, two typefaces and colors that we chose to indicate the ideas of the contents. Live action, song of protest, the power of headlines, polarizing imagery. And these are all like sub-headlines and sub-chapters in bigger chapters that were each a screen. On the north side of the gallery, there was a digital long touch screen wall that we also kind of find a way to create a design that makes it feel like one giant interface, even though the software divided it. And one of the things that the curator wanted to do is to reflect the idea of the revolution, specifically the energy of the street of the Cairo revolution. But they were also very specific about that being a gallery on the inside. They were not going to create actual walls. So we found a way to actually juxtapose the posters and put them in a way that allows you to see the work, but also have a sense of a little bit of a dynamic positioning and an organic way that these were hung. Another wall that talks about the revolutions and change brought by media, but driven by the will of the people. And lastly, on the way out of the exhibition, we wanted to bring a little bit of interactive to the visitor. So that wall that you see here is a magnetic big strip, and these little circles are also printed on magnetic paper. So what you can do is on your way out, there's a question that triggers the visitor to also feel that they're part of the action plan that's discussed in these exhibitions, that are part of the movements that the different societies around the Middle East help trigger, and to kind of help them engage more with the content. So it's a little bit of an interactive done physically, if you will. This is another quick different project for Saudi Arabia for their National Day. And this is probably the biggest graphic on the most low resolution screen we've ever designed. These are 4 towers in the digital media in Riyadh, and in celebration of the National Day of Saudi Arabia, we worked to create, again, the different acts and themes and create the illustration and animation and how they would work on all these towers. And what we wanted to bring is a little bit more depth to the story of a national day and avoid the repetitive national symbols. So we looked back into the culture of Saudi. We brought in a Saudi designer to help us conceptualize and imagine what these important aspects of everyday life that could be reflected on those towers, and how can we look at the connection between the different sides of these towers to create something that's exciting, that's cohesive, and that tells an interesting story. So, this brings us to the last project that I will share today. It's an identity for Mizna. Mizna is one of our clients in the USA, and it's an organization that documents Arab American stories through prose, poetry, and art. And their mission is to bring to life art and that represents Arab Americans and their concerns within the United States. So this is what their identity looked like before, and I think they started as a small organization, but eventually grew a little bit. They had a journal that had all their poetry, they had a film festival, they had a different graphic every time, they had events that they kept organizing, and a podcast that they did for a little bit, and the English and Arabic logo that didn't really mesh well together. So it's a natural thing that happens with successful organization. As they grow, the communication package that they have doesn't always cover their needs as they become more advanced. So what we did is really help them reorganize all that and whip it back into shape. And we did not propose a complete reimagination or rebrand. We just created a new logo that focuses on the abstract idea of their symbol, a modern way to draw it, focusing on the symmetry and basic on geometric proofing to create like a strong, solid mark. And then we wanted to create a system out of it, again, to allow it to deploy it in different places. And we thought of the Tatwir, Kashida, as a way that can be alive, that can be dynamic, that can allow the logo to live. But the goal of that is to allow the logo to operate as a masthead on top of a lot of different pieces of information that they might design, be it a small thumbnail online or a cover. And that also applies to a lot of their collaterals, from bookmarks to cards they distribute with their journals. And most importantly, it exists as a title on their journals to kind of unify and allow that journal to be also immediately recognizable. That was the first one they designed using the new identity, and the issue was focused on Palestine. And this is how the logo also elongates on the spine and kind of creates a nice rhythm for itself. And the idea of elongation was then also used to create a different but connected logo, and that is the Arab Film Festival that they run. And here we use again the top and bottom parts to create a mark that animates, inspired by how movies roll, to create the idea of something in motion. The logo can also be used as still on podiums. And then when it came to creating the award graphics, we wanted to give them something also special and unique. So we were inspired by olive branches to create the laurels of winning entries in the festival that are then used also in backdrops in the festivals when people arrive. It can also be used, the graph is a little bit cropped, but for the winning film, so each can have its own little graphic that they can repurpose and use. The last part of this project that I will show is a newsprint for Mizna. And that was in collaboration with Mizna and in partnership with the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it was created by Maryam Bazid. They wanted to create a newsprint and a collection of poems that would honor Sarah Hijaz's life and the lives of all LGBTQ Arabs and people of the Swana region and its diaspora. And the goal is to create a space for poetry and text to become a celebration of this life. So instead of creating a small booklet that can go